All right, everyone, welcome back. We're going to be doing another section of Introduction to Insect Morphology. This will be part 20 for beginning the talk about the insect nervous system. We're not going to get into super detail about it, but it is something worth at least briefly touching on. If you are watching these videos, it would help me a lot if you would like and subscribe, just so I know, who's out there that's real. So to start off with the insect brain, we have to start with the neuron. I will assume that you know at least a little bit about what a neuron is, but this is the basic cell of the brain and of the nervous system. So unlike other cells, it's not just a glob with a nucleus in it, although there is a nucleus here. The neuron cell body has two different input and output points. The dendrites are these, what would you call these? These are the branches coming off the top of the neuron body, the body of the cell, and this is for input. This is where electrical signals come in from other neurons and other nerves, and then the signal is processed and then passed down the axon, which then this is how more signals are sent, or the signal is continued to be sent to the next neuron and to the next neuron and so on. So in through the dendrites, processed in the cell body, out through the axon. There are four basic types of neurons within the insect brain. And this is also true for humans. There's the basic sensory neurons, and this is the neurons which collect sense data from the environment and from the body of the insect itself. So the most obvious ones would be like the five big senses. You have, sight, touch, taste. Sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. But there's other senses. Like those are the senses that we think of when we think of senses. And so, for instance, like obviously insects have eyes for seeing, and they have antennae, which they use to smell, and they generally have taste receptors, what we call taste receptors, on their feet, and they can, any various parts of the bodies can be used for touch sensing, specifically their hairs, their setae, and then many insects have an eardrum called a tympanum, which they can use to hear. But there are other senses. So I think I originally read there's something like 200 different types of senses, but this includes things like proprioception, like the positioning of your body parts in relation to each other, the positioning of your body in space, the how you're feeling internally. So you have senses for hunger and you have senses for thirst. You have pain receptors, light receptors, all sorts of receptors all over your body. These are all sensory neurons. After the sensory neurons, you have interneurons, and these are the neurons which connect to other neurons, interneurons. These pass the signals along, they process signals, and generally they lead to one of two things. There's the big one is motor neurons. These are the neurons which control muscle movement. So you have a sense, like, oh, I am hungry. Your interneurons take that message and process it, and then they cause the motor neurons to do something, like I'm going to go eat food now. And then the other one that is less talked about are the neurosecretory cells. These are neurons that secrete hormones. And in insects, these are very important. This is more of like a insect physiology topic, but these are the cells that secrete like the juvenile hormone, which is related to development and things like that. So this is a very important group of cells, but they're more related to the endocrine system. So now that we have talked about neurons, we can move on to the insect brain. The insect brain, if you will remember, I've talked about this briefly before in some of the earlier sections. It is a fusion of multiple sections. When insects were evolving, they originally started out as kind of a highly repetitive, segmented uh, organism, kind of like an annelid worm, where you have body sections. Um, each of these sections is called a metamere, and they contain an appendage or a set of appendages, one on each side of the body. There's usually some sort of respiratory hole, and in the interior there is a ganglion which controls the movement of those appendages and of the respiration and things. As insects evolved, these metameres fuse together, and this is a process called tagmosis, and the metameres fuse together into body parts called tagma. So like these three body parts, if you have like the three pairs of legs, this tagma that is created is called the thorax. And then the next tagma behind that is the abdomen. And the one in front of it is the head. And the head is made up of multiple metameres that have fused together to form that tagma. And so all of these ganglia get fused together into the insect brain, and really the central nervous system of the insect. So the insect brain is made up of multiple fused ganglia. And in this case, when we're talking about ganglia, we're talking about nerve centers. These are big batches of nerves which control major body functions. And in this case, at least 3 ganglia fused to form the major part of the insect brain. And then there's 2 minor ganglia centers that are made up of at least 4 more ganglia that have fused together. So the insect brain is made up of, the major part of the brain is made up of 3 sections, and it's kind of divided along these lines here. This is the protocerebrum, the deuterocerebrum, and these down here are called the tritocerebrum. These 2 here. Boop, boop. The protocerebrum is the major part of the brain. It's the largest part of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that controls the ocular lobes. These are the ocular lobes, and these are the ocellar. Ocellar lobes. So these are for the ocelli and the eyes. So this is for the compound eye. If I could spell compound eye. And these 3 are for the medial and lateral ocelli. Ocelli. I can never spell that word. So the protocerebrum is very much the part of the brain that controls vision and processes all the visual information of the insect. The deuterocerebrum has these antennal nerves. The deuterocerebrum, is the part of the brain that is primarily concerned with the controlling of smell. And each of these parts of the brain have structures internally. I'm not going to go over all of that. There's a lot of information about the internal structures of the insect brain. We're just going to do the kind of the overview of the brain. But the deuterocerebrum, the second part of the brain, controls smell and the antennae and the movement of the antennae. And then the tritocerebrum, this is kind of a leftover remnant of crustacean evolution. And on crustaceans, this would control the second pair of antennae. Insects only have 1 pair of antennae. So in insects, the tritocerebrum is usually highly reduced, and it kind of controls body information. A lot of the body information comes into the tritocerebrum and gets processed. A lot of nerve cords come off of this tritocerebrum. Below the tritocerebrum, you have 2 other gangliar masses. This is the frontal ganglia, and this smaller ganglia down here controls large parts of the digestive system. And then below that is the subesophageal ganglia. And this is a fusion of 3 separate ganglia, 3 ganglia fused, And these three ganglia control the mouth parts. So this is the mandibles, the maxillae, and the labium are controlled by the subesophageal ganglia. And it's called the subesophageal ganglia because in between all these nerve cords that are coming off the brain and the subesophageal ganglia, the esophagus passes through this, and above that esophagus, the frontal ganglia. So the esophagus would be, let me put it in a different color here. The esophagus would be here-ish, and the frontal ganglia would innervate the esophagus. So these are the major portions of the brain. And this is kind of the generalized structure. If we wanted to look at an old drawing of a more specific structure, this would be the more specific drawing of the brain of a locust. So this is a type of grasshopper. So you have the ocular lobes here. This would be this whole area here would be the protocerebrum. So, and then you have the ocellular nerves here. Below that would be the deuterocerebrum. These kind of things coming off here, these are for the antennae. And the tritocerebrum is very, very small. And then you have a large frontal ganglion to control the digestive tract. The subesophageal ganglia would be down here, but it's not in the drawing. So the next part of the nervous system is the ventral nerve cord, and this is what controls movement throughout the rest of the body. So this is kind of a cross-section of a honeybee, and I briefly mentioned the ventral nerve cord earlier in some of the earlier recordings about metamerization. If you remember what I talked about here, there's supposed to be a ganglia in the primitive insect. There's a ganglia that controls each section of the body. And these ganglia are connected together with nerves called the ventral nerve cord. And it's called the ventral nerve cord because unlike in humans or vertebrates, where we have a spine that runs down our back, the ventral nerve cord is on the ventral part of the body, so it runs down the stomach side of the insect. So the brain would be here, the subesophageal ganglion would be down here, and then the nerve cord is marked NC here. It actually runs down this, let me make this a little thicker so it's easier to see where I'm drawing. The ventral nerve cord runs down the ventral side of the insect and it connects all of the ganglia together. In bees, you'll have larger ganglia, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it runs underneath the esophagus, it runs underneath the digestive tract, runs below it on the ventral side, and it kind of inverted in insects compared to humans. The heart runs along the back. So up here is the heart. But we'll talk about that later when we talk about the circulatory system. So like what I talked about here, these ganglia are all connected in the primitive insect. And how it looks in the primitive insect from a top-down view, a dorsal view, you have the ventral nerve cord starting, so up here you have the brain, and below that you have the subesophageal ganglia, and then you have the ganglia in each of the body segments. So these three are for the thorax, and then these 8 are for the abdomen. And there's one ganglion per each for each abdominal segment, one for each thoracic segment, and they have nerves coming out of it. These are the nerves that control breathing for this segment and the movement of the limbs on that segment, or innervate individual organs, or the back ones here control the genitalia, things like that. This would be something like that you would see in a dragonfly. These are for flying insects. This is how the nerve cord is set up for primitive flying insects. So this would be something for dragonflies or mayflies. In more highly evolved insects, you actually see a fusion of ganglia on the nerve cord. So this is a very inefficient way of operating a central nervous system, because you have to have like an impulse up here. Let me change colors. Can you see? Yeah. I don't like that. You have to have an impulse in the brain, and then it has to flow. So you have an impulse here, and it has to flow down each of these ganglia, being processed and passed along. And so it can make for very inefficient electrical impulses. You have information lost along the way. And then let's say that goes all the way down to the genitalia and then has to come back up to be processed. And although this is moving at, like the speed of light or close to it, it is still slow, relatively speaking. So in the more advanced insects, the more highly evolved insects, the ganglia have migrated, and generally there's one large thoracic ganglion. And this is the fusion of all of these ganglia together into what, almost like a secondary brain. And this will control the wing movement, it coordinates the legs, it coordinates the organs, so all of this information gets processed here. So you'll have an impulse coming up this way, it'll be processed here, and then immediately send out another signal to control whatever it needs to control. And it's just much faster, it's a much more efficient system. So this would be something that you would see in like the fly or the bee, something like that, where they're very kind of efficient movers, they're very efficient flyers. You can kind of see this in flies, the way how acrobatically they can move around. They have very, very rapid reflexes, and it's part of that is because they have this highly centralized thoracic ganglion. Okay, so I want to stop for this section here. I might come back and talk a little bit more about some of the smaller parts, the highly sensitive and confusing parts of the insect neurology later, but this is a good, I think, overview of the basic work of the brain in insects and how the nervous system works. So I'm going to stop there for now, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks. Bye.